Morning everyone, and welcome to our first Onward event over in Central 5. We're absolutely delighted to be doing a major event this morning on Where's the Growth, and we're very grateful to our sponsors, the British Chambers of Commerce, because they have an excellent new report out which I thoroughly commend, which is their Global Competitiveness Report 2025, and it forms in many ways a very good framing for the discussion we're going to have today. I'm delighted to welcome our panel. First among whom, of course, is Sir Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, and Mel needs minimal introduction from me. He's a hugely experienced former minister, served as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions 2022 to 2024, formerly Leader of the House, Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Mel is someone who really understands government and really understands why growth matters. To my left, we have William Bain, the Head of Trade Policy at the BCC, and Willie has done a lot of work on policy advice, including at the British Retail Consortium and at Inline Policy prior to joining the BCC. And before that, he was the Labour MP for Glasgow North East. So a particularly warm welcome to William. And we have Catherine McBride, OBE, an economist focused on free markets trade and agriculture. And Catherine worked in financial services, trading equity and agricultural derivatives for 19 years. So she is someone who really understands the economics of growth and why it is that markets act as they do. And then to my far right, we have Ian Walker, the Industry Engagement Director at GSI UK. Ian has experience across government. He was the UK High Commissioner to Ghana. He was a member of the FCDO board and was a director in the Supply Chains Unit in the Cabinet Office, qualifying before that as a chartered accountant at EY. So a really first-class panel. We're very grateful to them for joining us, and I think it would probably be helpful if we had some early policy statements before we move to some Q&A. So Mel, would you like to lead us off on where is the growth? And
where is the growth? Well, there isn't much, I'm afraid, is the short answer to that question. But look, why does it matter? Growth is actually the magic bullet that will get us out of all sorts of binds that this country is in, not least the kind of headwinds that we're seeing around having to spend more on defence because of Trump's sort of dislocation of geopolitically from Europe, and we're having to stand on our own 2 feet, the kind of challenges we got from an ageing population, and the increased kind of healthcare costs, pension costs that go with that, and all sorts of intergenerational challenges I think we have around including younger people within the success of the economy, and of course against a backdrop of public finances which are in tatters at the moment. We're going to learn more about just how bad it is on the 26th of November during the budget. So if you look at the OBR actually when it talks about growth and its fiscal sustainability report, where it kind of projects out what's going to happen over the coming decades on our current trajectory, it does get into totally unsustainable territory. So debt to GDP ratios of several 100%. Which are completely infeasible. So if, though, you were to double the growth assumption, which is pretty minimal within those actual projections, that graph that's going out of control actually completely flattens. So the strength and power of growth is enormous. If we'd had the same level of growth that we had as a trend up to the global financial crisis of 2008 and continued on that trajectory, the economy today would be 25% bigger than it is now. So you could not have chosen a more important subject than growth. What is it that's going to drive it? It's going to be a whole bunch of different factors. I think that some of the focus of this is on offshoring as a particular theme within investment and growth. And a few quick observations on that. One is we've created an environment here, particularly for high net worth individuals, such that they're leaving the country, 16,000 over the last year. The tax that's just walked out the door with those 16,000 is equivalent to about 1/3 to 500,000 people on average earnings being taxed, so it affects everybody and is very difficult. The second thing I would say is the additional costs in the labour market in this country, particularly around national insurance and the red tape and the burdens thereof of the employment legislation that's coming down the line, is seeing a lot of offshoring, particularly in sectors like call centres and so on, and a lot of it going to other countries like South Africa. And the other thing I would say is energy costs, which is seeing a lot of industry locate elsewhere, and there's a big piece of discussion that we could have around that. But I think the principal drivers, very quickly, around growth is a big and complex puzzle, which is why it takes time for parties like ours in opposition to come up with the answers, not 5-minute quick fixes. And they centre on tax, getting tax down on wealth creation, job creation, and business expansion, getting the size of government down, and I made a sort of down payment on that in my speech yesterday of £47 billion, in order to free up the capacity to get debt down on the one side, but also to start getting taxes down and growth going on the other. We need to think about skills, the role of our higher education sector, where too many degrees are not actually conferring sufficient value added for those that are going through universities to justify either the cost to them or indeed the cost to the state, whilst at the same time net migration is falling. AI is churning up the labour market in ways that will be profound but rather unpredictable, and will therefore need a wider and more nimble skills offer. And so I think we need to be thinking very much about that. And then I think there are some big issues around welfare, and I spoke about some of those yesterday, particularly in the context of controlling costs and allowing those growth measures to therefore be brought forward. And finally, supply side planning, housing, rail, reservoirs, roads, and all of those kind of issues, which I've probably spoken for long enough. Hopefully, at least communicate so when it comes to growth, it is a complex picture, and there are many challenges, some of which will take quite some time to address.
Thank you very much, Mel. William, from the BCC perspective.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Ambassador. Thanks very much for being here in Manchester. It's a great event. You can feel the energy of the discussion all around the conference. And we hope to contribute to that this morning. We've been delighted to publish, as you say, a report on competitiveness last week. And I think the starting point is that Britain has a lot going for it. It's the 6th largest economy in the world, the 5th largest exporter in the world, the 2nd largest exporter of services, only second to the United States anywhere in the world. We have incredibly rich capital markets. We're one of the 3 leading financial sectors of the world. We're the 3rd largest source for inward investment globally too. So the picture has a lot of positives, a lot of blue sky. But there are some clouds on the horizon. And one of the things that we did in our report is address the key issue of competitiveness. And in terms of the World Competitiveness Centre's ranking, which is done globally, Britain is starting to fall behind. The most recent survey that was done this year, we were 29th out of 67 countries. That isn't good enough. So our report seeks to put competitiveness once again at the centre of economic and all other policy making that happens within government. We think it is absolutely critical that there is a competitiveness audit that is done each year to assess where budgets, but also other financial and spending policies are putting the UK in terms of where our global competitors are. And we also want government to work with industry to draw up an annual competitiveness action plan so that we can ensure that competitiveness is at the heart not just of fiscal events and King's speeches, but of everything that comes from government. And there are some areas where clearly progress needs to be made very quickly. As the Shadow Chancellor pointed out, in terms of costs, businesses are feeling the heat and feeling real pain from, for example, the employer's national insurance contribution rise, which is causing significant problems in local economies up and down the country. And we're now seeing pressure on employment and downward moves on employment as a result of the next rise. Energy costs really starting to bite as well. And the sense that regulation overall needs to be something that government is looking to reduce. And the impact of compliance costs is starting to be felt by businesses as well. So cost competitiveness is key. The specific ask we'll be making in terms of the forthcoming budget is that the energy profits levy starts moving back in a negative direction, because we do have concerns about the impact that's having on our ability to extract the potential from the North Sea and indeed long-term supply. In terms of innovation, again, our focus for the budget will be on government to deliver, don't just announce, but deliver key infrastructure projects. So we need that 3rd runway at Heathrow, we need the 2nd runway at Gatwick, we need expansion at Luton as well. But we also need other infrastructure projects delivered in terms of road and rail across the country. You know, AI is a massive potential success story for the UK. I recently was in Geneva at the World Trade Organization, and their World Trade Report points out that by 2040, we could increase global GDP by between 12 and 13% if countries invest well and now in AI. And that means we need the data centers. That means we need the energy supply in place. That means we need the water in place for the UK to turn the great potential into global leadership in these coming years. And finally, we need to be an open country when it comes to trade. The World Bank has us as one of the leading open trade countries, 64% openness to trade. We need to continue to make the most of some of the trade deals that have been made, some of them indeed begun by Shadow Chancellor and his colleagues. We have a major trade mission in India going on this week, and a great deal of global growth is going to be in that zone. But what our members believe in strongly when we've surveyed them this year is that we need to get the best trading terms and the best tariffs we can get with the Americas, principally the United States, with the Indo-Pacific region, and yes, with the European neighbourhood as well. And so we encourage this party, with its proud tradition of free trade, to reapply that principle and work with business to make us a high investing, highly productive and high growth country again.
Marvellous. Thank you, William. Catherine.
Oh, I'm next, am I? Okay, I was expecting to be last. In fact, do you want to go to Ian first? Because otherwise I'm going to repeat pretty much everything.
Well, in the interest of variety, but also hearing Ian's perspective. Ian.
Okay, yeah, good morning, everyone. I risk repeating some of what William has said as well, but I guess from my perspective, one of the real privileges of being a former High Commissioner is not just representing the country overseas, but it's actually looking back on your own country from abroad. And I really recognise what William says about the reasons to be positive about our country, as well as the many kind of real challenges that we have, and the importance of, I think, being really positive about so much of that. But I guess from my perspective in GS1, we have 62,000 members representing a huge part of the economy. And many of them are SMEs. And when we talk about growth and productivity, we hear a lot about regulation, particularly the ability to export to our nearest neighbours in Europe and beyond. And often unintentional kind of trade frictions that are being kind of created. So an example might be with the advent of the digital product passports across Europe, and making sure that our own construction regulations as they develop responding to Grenfell and the creation of the Building Safety Act, that we don't create different standards ostensibly for what's often the same information, and those kind of things actually creating costs, creating multiple sets of information for the same thing multiple times to multiple jurisdictions. So it may not be at the top level of policy, but it's the kind of thing that's actually stopping and slowing businesses from kind of growing. I think the second thing I might say, maybe perhaps just building on what William said around AI, hugely important from the work we do with our members, including across the NHS. And I think what's really key is that at the same time as we recognise the opportunity, say in healthcare, where the ability to massively improve the quality of cancer screening is a huge deal, it's really important we get the basics right and make sure that the actual backbone has open standards behind it, so that we can identify patients once, so that Ian Walker, if I turn up in Dundee or Derby, I don't have to keep presenting who I am, and that the GP records connect to each other. So they sound mundane, they sound operational, but making sure that the backbone talks to each other at the same time as we are investing in future-facing technologies. It's when the two come together, I think that we can really kind of unleash kind of UK.
Marvellous. Thank you, Ian. And Catherine, in turning to you, and in the interest perhaps of opening a slightly new angle, the role of the city in financial services in growth as well. I wonder whether that might be something in your opening remarks you might touch on alongside.
Well, I will, because in the introduction you kindly gave me, you missed out the fact that I was actually on the UK's Trade and Agriculture Commission, so I got to read all of the trade deals that were done under the last Conservative government. And one of the great things of the UK trade, as William pointed out, we are the second largest exporter of services, and services are now 58% of our exports. So that is our majority thing. Our largest sector is something called other business services. So it is larger than machinery. And that is great for other business services. However, a lot of that is to do with what's happened to the production of machinery and transport equipment, which used to be our largest goods export. In fact, it used to be our largest export of any type. As William said, there are a lot of things that have gone wrong. Regulation has made the UK a lot less competitive. Our high taxes has made us less competitive. But also our cost of energy. The biggest reason for manufacturing to be moving out of the UK is because of the cost of energy. Many people will try and tell you that our trade is down because of Brexit, but in fact, if you look at it sector by sector, the biggest drop in sectors has been fuels. Fuels basically means oil and gas in the UK. We don't export coal, although we could, and they're down 36% since 2019. And a lot of people like to muddy the water and pretend, oh, it's all because of Brexit, but that's nothing to do with Brexit. The EU is still buying our fuel, if we could just get it out of the ground, but we are producing less oil and gas because of the way we are both taxing it and regulating it and preventing new fields from being opened up. And that has been a tragedy for the UK because we don't have a lot of natural resources, but that's one that we really do have, and the whole world is still using it. It was a complete misunderstanding of the situation in global carbon emissions for someone to think that we were somehow saving the planet by making things in China rather than in Manchester or Glasgow or Belfast or all of Newcastle, all of the places we used to make things. And it's incredible that this has stuck, and what was bad under the last Conservatives has got worse under Labor, which is hard to believe. And I cannot agree with you more, William, that we must, you said reduce the energy profit levy. I would say remove the energy profit levy. You know, we were a large exporter of oil and gas before someone decided to tax it at 78%. I mean, like, what are the chances? You're all businessmen, I'm sure. You know, would you continue to operate if someone was going to tax your profits at 78%? Probably not. You'd probably start looking for other places, and that's what they're going to. And it's not just oil and gas, because oil and gas are the inputs of other commodities. So our second biggest export before was chemicals. So go back to 2019, the chemical industry was our second biggest export. Now that is also leaving the country. It's leaving the country because of high taxes, but it's leaving the country because it's inputs. It's major input. You know, organic chemistry, you learned it at school. It's oil and gas. You know, we've stopped making fertilizers here. We've stopped doing so many things we used to do because of a crazy idea that carbon dioxide emitted in China does not hurt the planet because it's Chinese or something. You know, it's the most insane thing. I was going to talk a little bit about the trade wars. We've got great trade agreements, and I'm very glad to hear that William and his team are going out to encourage people to trade with India and trade with the CPTPP countries. They are all growing. We have a lot of things we can do with them. I think far too many people concentrate on trading with Europe, and that might be convenient for an SME that doesn't do a lot of trade. But when you look at our trade statistics, it's not a lot of SMEs. Our SMEs really hardly trade at all. Our trade is done by large multinationals. It always has been. I grew up about as far away from this country as you can get, and pretty much everything we were eating and drinking was coming out of the UK companies, Cadbury, Schweppes, all of our drug companies. You know, you go into what we call a chemist in Australia, which is what you'd call a pharmacy, you will recognise every brand there. You know, these were all really big UK industries, and for some reason people discount them, and they're much more interested in selling the odd cheese to France. And it's like, forget it. You don't export food. Even now, after Brexit, we are only 65% self-sufficient in food in the UK. And it was 60% before we left the EU. We have actually increased that, so the farmers are doing a great job, but they have limited land, and they are getting paid to grow wildflowers, they're getting paid to plant trees, they're getting paid to put solar panels on their land, and all of these things are lowering our production. And if you have less production, you will import more and export less. So you can't trade unless you are competitive and you have product to trade. You know, the competitiveness is very important, but if you don't actually have the product, then you're not going to sell it overseas if you can't even supply your local market. So that is something we have to look at, is how much we produce, not just how efficiently we're producing it. If we want to be a trading nation, we might not want to be, but you know, I'm voting for trade.
I'm very much in favour of trade too. And actually, on that note, Ian, the BCC report emphasises the importance of economic diplomacy in bolstering our trade links. And with our, with your former FCDO hat on, how effectively do you think the UK does this? And how can we intensify those trading links, particularly, as Catherine says, outside the European sphere?
So I think when I think of my previous life, I was always struck by the lack of UK exporters, actually, particularly into developing economies, because so many of the largest kind of corporates have been often bought out by foreign larger kind of primes. And it was quite striking that actually it was as you touched on earlier, it's the services economy where we were looking to play a really important role, and it was often because of Brands Britain that people looked to the UK for the kind of confidence in our legal services, in our financial services, and the kind of the regulatory kind of context that we kind of brought. In terms of what we can do next, I mean my sense, and maybe I just pick on what Catherine said, I think clearly there's a piece for big, large global companies. I very much agree with that. We need to focus on what multinationals are doing. But I also do think we need to focus on SMEs as well. I think that the number of SMEs that are already trading globally, they just often don't realise it because they're doing it through marketplaces, through the likes of Amazon, through the likes of Google and other places like that. But they're doing it, but it's almost kind of slightly blind, and they're not aware that they're selling into markets where they will then be bound by their regulation, particularly in the context of the EU. So I think there's a lot we can be doing to make sure that we are, A, telling the story of the opportunity, but also making sure that we're equipping companies such that when they do come to trade, it's kind of digital first, that they are really thinking about how the information they are sharing is going to be regulatory compliant as well as kind of competitive in the market they're reaching into.
Thank you, Ian. Now, Mel, one of the biggest announcements of this conference has obviously been that the cost of energy and the Conservatives fundamentally reframing how we would approach the issues of balancing lower carbon emissions, but critically ultra-high energy input costs. Do you think energy costs are the single biggest impediment to UK growth? Or, I mean, how do you see, well, how much dividend do you see from our having acted in the way that we've announced this week?
So I think it's an enormous component, but one thread, as I sort of set out rather briefly earlier. I mean, if you look at energy costs compared to our competitors, we're about 4 times Canada, United States, 50% more than France. You cannot run a competitive economy, whether it's steel or indeed through, as William says, to the data centres of the future, which are huge consumers of electricity, and is actually one of those sectors where we do have an opportunity to be up there, not necessarily level pegging with America and China, but pretty close. If you take the electricity output of the Republic of Ireland, 20% of it goes solely into data centres, so it gives you a sense of the quantum and the challenge. But of course, energy costs being high pervades into all sectors of the economy. You know, by definition, any business that's using any form of energy, it has a sort of cost push pressure associated with it. Getting back to the broader picture around energy and oil and gas, I agree broadly with what has been said. It is an absurdity that we are choking off production in the North Sea, not just around the EPL, actually, but around the licensing arrangements for future extraction, at the same time as the Norwegians are extracting from essentially the same basin as we are choking off production. And in terms of the carbon argument, the replacement for that is often liquid natural gas coming into Milford Haven, shipped from around the world at 4 times the carbon footprint of actually taking it out of our own shores. Hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk. A great slug of tax, actually, that is being lost because if you're not producing, you're not raising the tax revenues. And, of course, the security issue in a world in which we're dealing with people like Vladimir Putin in Russia when it comes to energy. So to answer your question, Simon, I think energy is absolutely critical, which is why I raised it at the start. We as a party recognise that. We made some important announcements around the sort of balance between the green sort of levies and the cost to consumers, and getting, I think it's £165 off the average energy bill for consumers, because they're feeling it too. But yeah, a big central part of what we're looking at.
And of course, the question of sort of macro energy policy leads on to questions of industrial strategy. I mean, William, do you think industrial strategy is back under this government? And insofar as it is, do you believe it's working?
It's probably been back globally for almost a decade. I mean, if you think about some of the things that happened in the first President Trump administration, then the Biden administration, and now once again with President Trump too. And in a sense, other parts of the world have been sort of trying to catch up. The EU in the last 6 or 7 years has had a sort of green industrial strategy, and it has become important, I think, for countries to have a good response. Look, broadly, we think that the industrial strategies and trade strategies put together by the government are about right. They emphasise the right sorts of sectors: pharmaceuticals, professional services, advanced manufacturing, defence. Massive importance defence has as an engine of growth in the UK economy now, given where we are. And in terms of trade, yes, I mean, I think that we needed more tools in the toolbox. There are only so many countries one can make new FTAs with in reality, and they are quite sort of slow to bring about and generate, and they can be quite slow to operationalise and get converted into real export growth. So I think we do need to see more in the way of mini deals, sectoral deals, that can get benefits quickly. So in terms of energy, we should be looking to do a deal with Canada. We should be looking to expand sectoral deals with Brazil. We need supply chain agreements across the world with like-minded partners. So Greenland is important, Chile is important, US is important, but yes, also CPTPP in the European Union. So we need a more agile trade policy for this era that we're in. And there needs to be a strong interaction between trade policy and industrial policy. But the focus is delivery, delivery, delivery. There is no point in producing strategies if we cannot turn that into real export growth and better supply chains. And that is the challenge for this budget and the next period in Parliament.
And Catherine, as a trade expert, we obviously talk about making sure we have good relationships and deep relationships with different trading blocs around the world and with different individual countries. I think one of my sort of critiques of Brexit would be that thus far we haven't fully explored the opportunities of divergence as opposed to sort of convergence. Is that something you would you would accept, or would you characterise it in that way?
As both of the speakers have just said, we make expensive, high-end goods for rich countries, and we always have. So 80% of our exports go to about 20% of the world's country, not 20%, 20 countries, actually 20 countries. And they are not in Europe. 8 of those countries are in Europe, and they're the rich ones. They are, in fact, the same countries that were in the EU when we joined, when it was called the EEC. And all of the rest of the expansion of Europe really hasn't benefited the UK at all, because they can't afford, they don't want, they're not interested, or they produce the same stuff much more cheaply than we do. However, all around the world, if you look at it, Japan, as William rightly says, we've got to be very selective about our trade deals. And Canada, we already have 2 trade deals with them. We had one that we took from the EU. We are trying to improve it, and there's also that are members of the CPTPP. But we could do a lot more with them, because they could supply us with a lot of the raw materials and the iron and the steel. I've just written a massive paper for the Prosperity Institute about the trade that we could do with the US. Because though I'm very pleased that we've done some deals with them, there's a lot more that we could do with the US. We just have to open our mind to the fact that they sell a lot more than chlorinated chicken. And if people could just get over that, they'd be fine, you know. The defence sector, as William said, was always a big part of what the UK did. And unfortunately, it's disappeared. But something that I think one way we could improve what we do is that the US benefits hugely from competition between the various states. People like to say, oh, their electricity is a quarter of the price of ours. But that's not actually true. Each state has its own electricity, and you can look this up online. And so the industrial states have electricity that is about a sixth of what we're charging. And the places like California and Hawaii and Alaska, they all have quite expensive electricity. California because of its attitude to the green stuff. Hawaii has to import all of its oil to produce electricity, so that they bring up the average. And you know, people say, oh, it's four times. Well, it's not. And you've got to realise that you are competing with those industrial states. You're not competing with California so much, or maybe we are in some areas. And we could do that. There is no reason for us to have a national grid as much. You know, and two countries that have kind of got really badly hurt by the national grid are, of course, Wales, which is full of coal, and Scotland, which has a lot of the oil and gas and also the wind. And there's no reason why they have to turn off their windmills or stop their coal because we've got too much in the grid in England. It's like, well, that's where you put your data centre. You put your data centre right at the shore of wherever that power's coming in, and you can have wind farms that just do the data centre, you know, because they can't turn off, basically. They need the backup of the oil and gas. But you know, we could create a lot more competition between the various countries if we thought about it. But for some reason, we've tried to stifle that competition, and that's what makes the US great. Because the different states come up with different taxing ideas, different ways of doing things. Unfortunately, the only country that has the ability to change its tax is Scotland, and the only thing the Scottish government could think to do was to increase them, which was a pity, because if they'd have gone, oh, actually we're going to halve our corporate tax, they might have discovered a whole lot of businesses move up to Scotland, but, you know, that's my beef.
Well, one of my most radical thoughts as a minister in local government was that some tax decentralisation could be quite interesting, because obviously, ultimately, you might end up with some Conservative mayors who would take taxes down. But I think that is one for another day. Mel, as we look ahead to budget, and what is obviously, you know, predominantly, clearly a moment of real concern to British business and British households, but trying to be positive, what would you say is the single most helpful thing or series of things that the Chancellor could do to try and reinstigate growth? So we will accept that we do not agree with her macroeconomic theory, but what levers does she have which could materially help us this autumn?
So I think the best thing she can have actually is a time machine to take her back to just before the general election, not taking the choices that she did. So I'll come to your point about the most positive thing that I think she could do, but I think just on the general question of what she might do generally, is she's become very boxed in, so growth is kind of what it is. She has backbenchers who have killed her fairly modest attempt at welfare reform and savings, and sent a clear signal just to her, but to the markets more generally, that this government is not able to start controlling spending. I think that's probably where we are. And all roads therefore lead back to tax. If the question is, well, how much tax is she going to have to raise to fill the fiscal black hole that has emerged, bearing in mind that she had about 10 billion in fiscal headroom back in October last year. She blew that plus 50% on top. She rebuilt it in the spring. She's now in the same position again. I think that's, the jury's out. So there's a spectrum there, I think, between anything from all the headroom's gone and probably another 10 to 15 billion, right the way through to the NIESR, who suggests there could be the 10's gone plus another 42. If you were down the NIESR's end of the spectrum, it's almost inconceivable, it seems to me, that you wouldn't have to go into one of the three heavy lifting taxes, i.e. income tax, national insurance or VAT, in order to start filling that gap. Those taxes collectively raise about 75% of all the tax in the country. That would be a breach of the Labour Party manifesto. There'd be no ability to fudge that, and I think that will put the government and the Chancellor personally into fairly precarious waters. If it's at the lighter end, then I think you could almost guarantee she will extend the freeze on the threshold around income tax, which would leave her in about 10, and maybe gambling, maybe the banks, because politically they're an easy hit, though I think that would be a wrong decision, because that is an attack on business and by extension on businesses that rely on our financial services and lending sector. In terms of what will drive where we are on that spectrum will be firstly the fact that she's got a bunch of unfunded commitments now because she failed to get the welfare reforms through and U-turn the winter fuel payment. She's got about 6 or 7 billion sitting there. And the second thing is the conclusion that the OBR draws on its assumptions around productivity growth going forward, which have been to date relatively optimistic, and there's a lot of speculation that they will downgrade. Every 0.1% downgrade on productivity going forward in the forecast is about 9 billion. So people are talking about 0.2 being 18, maybe 20. So anyway, I suspect where you are on that spectrum is perilously at the tipping point between whether she has to break the manifesto commitments or not. To your question, what would I be doing? Well, if I were in exactly her position and I had to deal with tax, I would probably be, and I was down that end of the spectrum where it was really big, I would probably go for income tax on the basis that VAT would be inflationary, and we've got a sticky inflation problem here, which is keeping interest rates higher for longer than we should otherwise be facing. High implications for the debt servicing costs that are running at 100 billion a year, or twice what we spend on defence. I'd be very worried about that. But I wouldn't want to be in that position, but that would be the cleanest thing to do. But the second thing I would do, given we've got an economy at the moment that has the lowest level of business confidence in history, the IOD's latest survey, lower than ever before in any IOD survey, okay, it's that bad, is I'd be desperately trying to find some way of raising the animal spirits in the business community. So I might, if I were her, look at doing something on tax somewhere and trying to row back on some of the stuff, the damage I'd done in the tax territory around businesses. Try and give them something that the day after the budget they said, my God, that was really bad, but we knew it would be. But do you know what? There's something here that we can hold on to. A little bit of hope. So I'd be looking for that little bit of hope. But it's a very bleak and difficult situation she's in.
Yeah. Thank you, Mel. And on that basis, I think it's time to open questions to the floor. What I'll do is I'll take them in groups of 3. So if we go with the gentleman with the beard in the second row, then gentleman immediately behind, and then gentleman at the back.
So I'm a councillor in Hamburg, but also my background is in manufacturing and business. In Hamburg, we've got 2 big local businesses. They turn over 200 to 300 million pound a year. They were struggling anyway with all the things that you say, like energy and things like that. But when the national insurance tax came in and the minimum wage went up, I spoke to both of those business owners and they said, that's it now, enough's enough. So since then what they've done is they're looking at going to America. And the reason is they both export a lot to America, and they say America is welcoming us with open arms, and Britain has become anti-business and we can't stay anymore. So my question is, when I sit with both of those business owners, why do I tell them to stay in Britain? What can I say to them to get them to stay? Because at the minute they say, absolutely no chance, unless you can convince us.
Well, William, do you, we'll take the 3 questions, but I think on that one I might invite you to come back first when we come to the questions.
Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Robert Morland, I'm from Gloucester. I'm also a former member of the European Parliament. My question is quite simple, in the sense that about the first thing, apart from take away my winter warming grant, the Labour government did was to come to a number of Labour deals, including the ones with the trains, and they did not go forward with any agreement on labour productivity on that, and I believe it's the same with the recent tube drivers. I can remember from my student days, it's a few years ago, that then was a big issue, and I think it's been continuing a big issue. Would you agree, and would it be something that we've really got to grasp?
Thank you, sir. And then third question at the back.
Morning, my name's Peter. I'm a reporter at The Telegraph. I would say the message of this conference, or one of them, has certainly been fiscal responsibility and trying to draw that line. So I'm interested actually on winter fuel. Do you regret last year campaigning so hard to force Labour to U-turn on that?
Marvellous. Well, William, do you want to lead off on why business should stay in the UK?
Well, I mean, I think the points that you've made, sir, are really well made. I mean, we do many business surveys throughout the year, and the one change I would say that really in the last 6 months we've been picking up is that, you know, up until then, cost of living issues and inflationary pressures were the number one concern for businesses, and then it shifted quite abruptly to tax, and of course that does come in with the introduction of the employer's national insurance rise, the above inflation rise in the national minimum wage, and of course the Employment Rights Bill consequences as well. So all of these have created difficult conditions for employers and reduced the ability to invest. Business rates are also something that we pick up from chambers across the country as an increasing problem. And so by the end of this Parliament, in terms of business rates in England, we would like to see that rate poundage come down to 45p at the most by the end of this Parliament. So business rates are also a big issue. But look, we are a great country. We have, you know, an incredibly skilled workforce, a workforce that is adaptable and agile. We have, you know, infrastructure that I think helps us get goods to ports relatively quickly. So there's a lot of good that's out there, but tax is the big question, and that's why we need some relief in this budget and in the remainder of this Parliament to get that burden down on businesses. No new taxes for businesses in this budget.
On the second question on trade union reform, Mel, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think Robert is absolutely right. So if the question is, if we had the time machine and we went back before the election, what would I have done differently, given the public finances at that time? It would have been three things. One would have been different choices on tax, and we've all agreed that taxing businesses and jobs has been ruinous. The second thing would have been to have gone much, much further on welfare in particular and controlling spending and not borrowing loads of money and stoking inflation. But the third thing is exactly what you've raised, productivity. It was mad to have settled 14% with the train drivers, 22% with the junior doctors and so on, without any productivity strings attached whatsoever. We know that in areas of the public sector, productivity in some areas, including health, since the pandemic, certainly until more recent times, very recent times, has been actually going backwards. And if you get yourself in that position, I think what Labour thought was, oh, well, we can go in and we can just kind of buy these folks off and then all get back to work, and then the problem will go away, and of course you'll then get a boost to output because they're working, not striking. Well, they've all come back, only once again, you know, there's no productivity gains on the table. So I just totally agree with you. There should have been productivity arrangements around those agreements that were struck.
There's that old saying, if you give a mouse a cookie, it's going to want a glass of milk. And then Mel, on the third question on winter fuel.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, because that comes with a £1.6 billion price tag, so it's not an insignificant thing. I think the point there that people often fail to spot is that if the argument is, look, very wealthy people don't need the winter fuel payment, so why not just not give it to them and give it to the people that really need it? You need a mechanism by which you can differentiate those that really need it and those don't. Given that the trigger for the payment of that is pension credit, which in itself cannot be determined from the centre but relies on people applying for it, because you can't tell what their economic circumstances are from the centre, including their level of savings. That therefore meant that scrapping it in the way that was proposed meant that 80% of those pensioners who were going to lose it were below the poverty line. So it was unfortunately something that, in my judgment and others of my colleagues, actually would have hurt a lot of very vulnerable people very hard, notwithstanding the fact that if you had a mechanism that could separate those that don't need it from those that desperately did need it, then I think we would have come to a different judgment. But that's the reason.
Okay, next set of questions, please. So gentleman on the left, then lady in the front row, and then Lucy.
Just a quick one on Europe, actually. What's the panel's view about the government's present line is dynamic alignment? That's the phrase they've been using in order to minimise, as they would argue it, tariff barriers with the European Union. To what extent is our movement towards Europe, which this government wants, damaging competitiveness long term?
Okay, question number one. Well done, James. I keep picking people right across the room just to keep you fit.
Sophie Ing, I'm a journalist at Politico. Shadow Chancellor, you've mentioned various challenges facing businesses like energy costs, employment red tape. Are you also concerned about the impact of US tariffs on the British economy? And could Labour have got a better deal with Trump? Thank you.
And question 3.
Thank you. Lucy Trimnell from Somerset. So my question is about young people. So young people are living within a capitalist system. They are benefiting from it in many ways, not in all ways, but they are being told that capitalism is why their lives are harder than the lives of young people generations before them. They're being told that it's therefore a dirty word, that therefore growth, productivity, all of those things are bad things and designed for other people, other people's benefits and not theirs. We need those people to vote for a party that is going to be pro-growth, pro-business, enterprise. How do we get the difference in those young people from believing these are bad things to recognising the good that could come of growth and capitalist society in general?
Marvellous. Well, on question 1, on trade, I think, Catherine, if I would start with you.
Okay.
I suspect we'll get a good, punchy opinion here.
Well, okay. With the EU dynamic alignment, I do believe that will be disastrous for the UK. I don't think the UK has grasped the opportunities that Brexit has given it to really change its regulation to suit itself. But there have been thousands of micro changes. And there is, in fact, a book that's just been published called 75 Brexit Benefits, which you can get on Amazon. And that is quite a good list, because a lot of people, if you're not in the industry, you might not be aware of how something has changed. I know in financial services we changed a lot of things, and we did it the moment we left by statutory instruments. And if you're outside of that market, you probably have no idea, and you probably didn't even know what the double volume cap was anyhow. So you're not concerned about dark pool trading, you won't worry about it. But those were things that really hurt the UK because we had much bigger markets and bigger investment funds running out of the UK, and they were sort of being hamstrung by some silly regulations that the French had put in. And weirdly, after we left and after we changed those regulations in the UK, lo and behold, the EU decided to change them as well. So, you know, if we understood our power, you will find that if we change regulations to suit us, more often than not, the EU will actually follow us rather than, you know, going off in a huff, especially in industries where we are very strong. And with the US, I think that what Trump has done is very interesting. It's very important strategically and for defence reasons that if they do onshore a lot of the industries that they just lost. And we had the same problem. During COVID, we realised that the Chinese were making a lot of things that we needed desperately, including the chips that went into the cars. So our car exports dropped dramatically during COVID, which a lot of people like to blame on Brexit as well, but it was actually because we were missing a $600 chip that goes into most of those cars. So 60,000 pound cars could not be exported or sold, and 80% of the cars we make are made for export. So it's a really big export industry, and for it to be held up because we couldn't get a chip out of China was kind of crazy, and yet we let ourselves get to that. And also they make the ingredients that go into pharmaceuticals, the active ingredients are mainly made in China. So it's important to bring that back, which is another thing that Trump is doing. The tariffs have kind of hit the UK, but not that much. I think the deals we've done are very good. If you read my trade report with the US, what will surprise you the most is for years we've benefited from virtually free trade into the US. They had very low tariffs and they had no VAT. So it was actually cheaper to buy UK goods in the US than it was to buy them in the UK. Because every time you go shopping, the biggest part of what you just bought, the biggest part of the money goes to the government. The poor old manufacturer and the shopkeeper and the guy who owns the shop who's getting the rent, they get a fraction of what the government takes with 20% VAT. If you just take 20% off, you'd find people would buy more goods. And that's what the US did. They never put it on. So their tariffs are actually levelling that playing field a little bit. And it's interesting that people are getting so upset about it, but there is a chart in the paper I wrote for Prosperity about the US-UK trade. And I compared their after the 10% increase tariffs on most imported foods and our tariffs on imported foods. And it shouldn't surprise anyone in this room to know that our tariffs on imported food are still higher than the US. I mean, it's incredible for all the huffing and puffing the media have done about Trump's tariffs. Ours are still higher. So if anyone in this room really dislikes Trump's tariffs, let's start by lowering our own. And in credit to the Conservative Party, they did. When Liz Truss was the Trade Secretary, they got rid of all of the tariffs below 2%, and they lowered a lot of the agricultural tariffs slightly. So if the tariff on beef, for instance, was £2.53 plus 12.6%, actually it was in euros, so they converted the fixed cost to pounds, and then they lowered the 12.6% to 12%. So not massive changes, but they did lower them slightly. But it is crazy that we've got such high tariffs and we complain about Trump. It's like, no, that's not where it is.
Okay. Mel, to Sophie's question.
Sophie's question is about younger people.
Sophie's question was on. Was on tariffs.
Right. Okay.
In particular, I think today's announcement's on steel. Is that the EU tariffs on steel?
Yeah. Okay. So tariffs overall are just not going to be a good thing, in my opinion. I'm a great believer in comparative advantage and all the theory around that, and everybody gains across the piece if we have free trade, and that's the central argument for it, and it's the reason why, as Catherine said, we're predominantly exporting high value added goods, because that's what we do well, and that's where we have our comparative advantage compared to other things that we import that can be done more cheaply elsewhere. What drives it, I suppose, is to a degree kind of getting back to industrial policy and the way in which economies develop and areas of economies that can get hollowed out through international competition. You've seen that in the United States, the Rust Belt and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that the Trump love of tariffs, amongst other reasons, including the fact that I suppose they're a good stick with which to bludgeon other people when you want various things, whether they be economic or political, is as a reaction to that particular element. It seems to me that tariffs shouldn't be the answer to that. It should be actually a better industrial policy that recognises that you have to have levelling up and all of that kind of stuff in the mix. The biggest problem, I think, with tariffs, amongst others, is also the inflationary pressures that it introduces within economies. Now, we're seeing some of the emergence like that in the States, although it's muted because one of the reactions to tariffs coming in, of course, is stockpiling, and so we've yet to see sort of some of those forces going through. But that will exert itself in different ways, none of which will be positive, I think, for the world economy, given the size of the United States economy. We have to worry about trade diversion in a world of tariffs. So that is countries then switching to other markets, including ours, and very aware of issues around dumping and taking appropriate action too. I totally defer to Catherine on expert views around trade and tariffs. I would say, though, that there have been sectors over here that have been very badly damaged by this, and I think Catherine's earlier comments about the decline of chemical exports, and you think about ethanol, which was kind of just wiped off the face of our economic map almost at a stroke when Keir Starmer took a phone call from Trump at a football match and said he'd throw in to the deal tariff arrangements around ethanol, which is probably the final death knell of places like Grangemouth and other areas. The other thing I would say in terms of I think the question was the question about whether the government had conducted the trade deals effectively compared to other countries. I think a couple of things on that. I think they could have moved things forward a little bit faster, a little bit earlier on in terms of getting in the room. I think having people like Peter Mandelson and where that ended up as our ambassador over there were unfortunate. And I think the other thing is actually tying a deal down so it's truly done, rather than something at proposed steel that seems to move around. You know, one thing is apparently agreed 1 minute and then it's not quite agreed. You know, you've got to tie these deals down and get them signed and the ink dry on the paper to make them stick.
Ian, presumably you were involved in some trade negotiations. I mean, do you I mean, I don't want to put you in an invidious position, but do you feel the government has handled the recent raft of trade deals well?
I need to probably pass on that a little bit, but I think on the substance of it, I think for me what's really interesting is this kind of sense of how the subject slightly moves around at times, and actually looking back just kind of 3 years, the big focus is on things around kind of supply chain resilience, as well as bits around kind of trade and tariffs. And at the heart of it is this sense of how do we make sure that in a globalised economy, I think to the question that came at the end as well, in a globalised economy, how do we make sure that actually selling into global markets is a good thing and the unintentional barriers to trade are a bad thing, and we try and make sure that we are minimising that to try and help companies in the UK grow. I think there are some really important kind of practical points that sit well underneath that. So I think I'll plead
take the fifth on
the fifth on the government policy. But but I think to your point, we've really got to find a way of getting growth to feel like not something government does, but something it's industry that drives growth.
Yeah.
It's not government. And I think quite a lot of the
100%.
narrative tends to focus on what government does. Clearly a really important role, but it's industry that drives it. And some of the I guess some of the macro points we see about kind of policy short-termism that we all know of, they're real. You know, the NI impacts are real. They are really kind of having not just an impact on that moment, but then all the consequential impacts on investment, on kind of other kind of opportunities for business. So I think we've got to really grasp this in a really pragmatic way and recognise that we've got to get industry into this conversation a lot more actively than perhaps we have done to date.
I thought Lucy's question is a good one to end on, given we have a representative of the Conservatives here and a very much former representative of the Labour Party. But how do we make the popular case for growth? And William, I mean, on a sort of bipartisan basis, what is the way to make growth a relatable, popular concept? Because often, I don't think, as a word, it resonates with people.
I mean, the only path to sustainable prosperity that millions of people can feel in their pockets and in their family budgets every month across the country is increased investment and increased productivity. There are no shortcuts. Anyone who tells you they are is not answering the question right. So that's what we need to focus on. And I think that segues very nicely back into the business agenda, which is all about how we can make business more productive. Because what that allows business to do is to have the time and the resource to invest. And it's that investment that is going to be key to our future. So that's what we would encourage all political parties to focus on.
That is beautifully done. And Mel, as our final remarks of this panel, making the Conservative case for growth, because in saying where is the growth, I think we also need to reaffirm to millions of people why it matters.
So, gosh, it matters for so many reasons. It matters for the fact that the economy currently is on a trajectory which is unsustainable, and growth unlocks that problem substantially. It matters because if we want to be a country that can sort of hold its head high in the world and be a force for good and champion our values in the face of China and Iran and Russia and North Korea and places like that, and other stuff that's going on, we can only do that if we have a strong economy. We can only have a strong economy if we have growth. If we address to the question of intergenerational fairness, if we're going to address those things, we need a growing economy. And I think the components part of that is, let me take you back, say, to the 1980s, when it was possible as a young person to go to a university, get a reasonable degree, not be saddled up with debt, get on the housing ladder by working reasonably hard, earn a reasonable amount of money, and through asset price inflation around property become wealthier. the pivot point between that kind of world and where we are now for young people, which is largely absent those things, is about the age of the early 40s. So it's actually not very young people who are caught up in this. It's much further up the age round. So I think in terms of the importance of getting it right, and I think yours is possibly one of the most important questions that's been asked today, if you look at social attitude surveys amongst very young people, this disconnection with the economy and other factors leads rather disturbing results. Young people that wouldn't want to fight for king or country, young people that don't think democracy is the best system. They think that strongman dictatorships is actually a better model. And I think that is a sense of a disconnection, and part of that is the economy. So to your question as to what you have to do, I think you have to look at the further education, higher education space in the way I described earlier, which I think will free up opportunities for less burdens and more productivity gains for students. I think secondly, housing is absolutely critical, and I announced yesterday morning, for example, that if we can get on top of spending, then we can get taxes down. And one thing that I committed us to is that the first £5,000 of a first job, a young person going to a first job, would be hypothecated into a saving fund as a deposit against a future property. And I think we can signal and try and include in that way, that's an early down payment of that, a higher real wage growth economy. So growth will make younger people benefit more. They're not relying on asset price inflation, they're relying on good jobs that pay well. That is what you tend to get in a high growth economy. The final point is popular capitalism, I think. So in the 80s, I'm not saying it was perfect, but there was the kind of Telsid owned shares. If you go to New York now and you get a taxi, the taxi driver might say to you, what do you think of Apple stock at the moment? No taxi driver in London would ever possibly say that.
It's the closure of Oxford Street.
He'd moan about the traffic, wouldn't he? Exactly. So somehow we have got to shift to this sense that the zeitgeist is about a popular capitalism. That is inclusive. That looks after younger people. That shows them that shows them a way in which they can get a slice of it. And that is something that I'm deeply committed to coming up to the solutions with. And what I had to say about young people, national insurance yesterday was part of that process. So thanks for your question. It's a great question.
Well, thank you, all of you, for being part of today's panel. Thank you, as our guests, for being with us. We've got a packed programme of events through the day. So we move on through sex-based rights, to welfare to work, to energy policy, to rewiring the state, to an in conversation with Chris Philp. You name it, we've got it. So please stay here with us in Onward Central 5. But thank you all very much.
Well done. Great job.
Well done, mate. It was fantastic.